combat medic who survived 3 war zones sat bleeding in a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m., not from enemy fire, but from the very people sworn to protect her. The armed officers surrounding her car had no idea the exhausted woman in blood-soaked scrubs possessed clearance levels that could end their careers with a single phone call. 30 seconds later, when she finally pulled out her military credentials, their smug faces went white. But by then, it was already too late to take back what they'd done. Before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Stick with me until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far these stories travel. The fluorescent lights of Mercy Ridge Hospital flickered against the midnight sky like dying stars. Inside, the emergency department had finally gone quiet after 6 straight hours of chaos. A construction accident, 2 overdoses, and a stabbing that painted the trauma bay floor in streaks of dark red that no amount of bleach would ever fully erase. 33-year-old Sarah Reeves pushed through the staff exit with trembling hands, her scrubs stiff with dried blood that wasn't hers. Her shift had started at noon. It was now approaching 3 in the morning, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The cool October air hit her face, but it did nothing to wash away the image burned into her mind. The 20-year-old kid on the operating table whose heart had stopped beating no matter how hard they'd fought to bring him back. She'd seen death before. Too many times. But it never got easier. Sarah collapsed into the driver's seat of her aging Honda Civic and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The engine stayed off. She needed 5 minutes to decompress before attempting the 15-mile drive home to her empty apartment in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. That's when the security truck rolled up behind her, blocking her exit. At first, she didn't notice. Her mind was still replaying the moment the attending physician had called time of death, the way the kid's mother had collapsed in the waiting room, the sound that came out of her that didn't seem human. Then came the knock on her window, sharp, aggressive, impatient. Sarah flinched, her heart rate spiking instantly. Training kicked in before conscious thought. Her hand moved toward the door lock, but she stopped herself, forced her breathing to slow, and turned to see who was there. Hospital security officer Marcus Tang stood outside her window, flashlight aimed directly at her face. Even through the glass, Sarah could see the irritation in his expression, the way his jaw was set like she'd personally offended him by existing. She rolled down the window halfway. "Can I help you?" Tang's voice came out clipped, authoritative in the way people sound when they're used to not being questioned. "You've been sitting here for 20 minutes. This is a staff-only lot. You need to move along." Sarah blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the statement. I work here. I just got off shift." "ID? Excuse me?" "Show me your employee ID, now." Something cold settled in Sarah's chest. She'd dealt with Tang before. Everyone on night shift had. He had a reputation for hassling nurses, especially women, especially when supervisors weren't around. There were whispers about complaints filed and mysteriously lost, about HR meetings that went nowhere, about a man who enjoyed the small amount of power his uniform gave him just a little too much. Sarah reached slowly for her bag in the passenger seat, moving deliberately so he could see her hands. Her military training whispered in the back of her mind, "De-escalate, comply, document everything." She pulled out her hospital badge and held it up to the window. Tang barely glanced at it. "Step out of the vehicle." "Why?" "Because I'm telling you to. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm an employee taking a moment before driving home after a 16-hour shift." Tang's expression hardened. He stepped back and spoke into his radio. "Yeah, I need a unit at Mercy Ridge, staff lot, section C. Possible intoxication, uncooperative individual refusing to comply." Sarah's exhaustion evaporated, replaced by something sharper. "You're calling the police because I'm sitting in my own car? You're slurring your words. Your clothes are covered in what appears to be blood. You're exhibiting erratic behavior." Tang's voice had taken on a formal quality, like he was already writing the incident report in his head. "For all I know, you're high on something you stole from the pharmacy." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard stories, nurses accused of drug theft, of being addicts, of stealing medication. It was the easiest way to destroy a medical career, and Tang had just said it loud enough for his radio to pick up. "I'm a trauma nurse. This blood is for my patients, And I'm not slurring. I'm exhausted because I just spent 16 hours trying to save lives. Then you won't mind waiting for the police to verify that. Tang walked back to his truck, positioning it so she couldn't drive forward or backward without hitting something. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. Her training told her to stay calm, to let this play out, to trust the system. But another part of her, the part that had survived Kandahar and Mosul, and situations far worse than a parking lot confrontation with a wannabe cop, knew exactly where this was heading. She pulled out her phone and started recording. 7 minutes later, 2 Columbus PD cruisers pulled into the lot, lights flashing, but no sirens. Sarah watched in her rearview mirror as 4 officers climbed out, hands resting casually on their duty belts as they approached. The lead officer was Detective Ryan Walsh, mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of night shifts and bad coffee. His partner, a younger officer Sarah didn't recognize, hung back near the second cruiser. Tang met them halfway, gesturing animatedly toward Sarah's car. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could guess. Suspected drug use, covered in blood, refusing to comply, erratic behavior. Walsh approached her window with the practiced casualness of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Evening, ma'am. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" Sarah kept her voice level. "Officer, I'm a registered nurse. I just finished my shift. I was taking a moment to decompress before driving home." "I understand that, but I still need you to step out." "Am I being detained?" Walsh's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Just step out of the car, and we can sort this all out." Sarah knew that game. It was the same game that turned routine traffic stops into arrests, that turned just asking questions into searches and seizures. She'd seen it play out before, both in uniform and out. But she also knew what happened to people who refused. She unlocked the door and stepped out slowly, keeping her hands visible. The cool night air made her shiver, or maybe it was the adrenaline finally catching up. 4 police officers, 1 security guard, all focused on her like she was a threat that needed to be contained. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." "You're searching me." "Standard procedure. Turn around." Sarah complied, her palms flat against the cold metal of her car's roof. Walsh's hands moved professionally, quickly, checking her pockets and waistband. The other officers fanned out, one peering into her car windows, another standing ready like she might suddenly bolt. "She's clean," Walsh announced. "What's in the bag?" "My personal belongings, wallet, keys, phone, medical supplies." "Medical supplies? I'm a nurse. Sometimes I carry basic first aid equipment." Tang's voice cut in from behind. "She could have stashed narcotics in there. I've seen it before." Walsh reached past Sarah and grabbed her bag from the passenger seat. She wanted to protest, to demand a warrant, to invoke the Fourth Amendment protections she knew she had. But she also knew how that would look. Refusing a search meant you had something to hide. It meant escalation. It meant handcuffs and a trip downtown and a report that would follow her forever. So she said nothing as Walsh dumped the contents of her bag onto the hood of her car. Wallet, keys, lip balm, a protein bar, tampons, a small first aid kit, her phone still recording from inside her pocket, and a worn leather case that Walsh picked up with careful fingers. "What's this?" "Open it." Walsh flipped it open. Even in the dim parking lot light, Sarah could see his expression change. The casual authority drained out of his posture, replaced by something else, something that looked like recognition, or maybe regret. Inside the case was her military ID, still valid despite her discharge 3 years ago. Beside it, commendation medals on faded ribbons, a combat medical badge, a Bronze Star citation with her name printed in neat black letters. Sergeant Sarah Reeves, U.S. Army, 68W Combat Medic. 3 deployments, 15 months in Afghanistan, 8 months in Iraq. A medical service record that included everything from treating battlefield wounds under enemy fire to performing emergency surgery in the back of a moving Humvee while insurgents tried to blow them off the road. Walsh stared at the case for a long moment. Then he looked up at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're a veteran. I'm a nurse who's being harassed in a hospital parking lot for sitting in her own car." Tang stepped forward, trying to salvage whatever authority he thought he had. "That doesn't change the fact that she was acting suspicious. She was sitting in a car after a long shift." Walsh's voice had gone flat, the friendliness completely gone. He turned to his partner. "Get back in the cruiser. We're done here." "But we're done." The younger officer hesitated, glanced at Sarah, then walked back toward the car. The other two officers followed, clearly uncomfortable with how this had played out. Tang wasn't ready to let it go. "You're just going to leave? I called you here because you wasted our time." Walsh closed Sarah's military case and handed it back to her, along with the rest of her belongings. "Ms. Reeves, you're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience." Sarah wanted to scream, wanted to tell them exactly what they'd just done, how they'd treated her, what this would look like if she decided to file a complaint. But exhaustion was crashing over her again, heavier now, mixed with anger and humiliation and the lingering adrenaline that made her hands shake as she gathered her things. "That's it?" she said quietly. "That's all you're going to say?" Walsh's jaw tightened. "I suggest you file a formal complaint with hospital administration if you feel your rights were violated." "Right, because that always works." She climbed back into her car, her whole body trembling now. Walsh and his partners were already walking away, clearly eager to move on to the next call. Tang stood near his security truck, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that said this wasn't over. Sarah started her engine. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word, every moment. She'd learned that lesson in Kandahar when a supply sergeant tried to pin missing equipment on her squad. Document everything, trust nothing, protect yourself because no one else will. She was about to put the car in reverse when her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Mass casualty incident. All available staff report to ER immediately." Sarah's stomach dropped. She looked toward the hospital entrance and saw ambulance lights already appearing in the distance, multiple units converging on Mercy Ridge from different directions. Her radio, still clipped to her waistband from earlier, crackled to life with frantic voices. "Multiple vehicle collision on I-70. Possible chemical spill. We need all trauma staff now. At least 15 critical, more incoming. Can't find Dr. Patterson. Someone page surgical." Sarah sat frozen in her car, her exhaustion suddenly meaningless. She'd just been harassed, searched, and humiliated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Every rational part of her brain said to drive away, to go home, to let someone else handle this nightmare. But her hands were already turning off the engine. She climbed out of her car and started running toward the ER entrance, her worn scrubs still stiff with dried blood from the last crisis. Behind her, she heard Walsh call out something, but she didn't stop, didn't look back. The automatic doors burst open as she approached. The scene inside was already descending into controlled chaos. Nurses scrambling to set up additional trauma bays, techs wheeling equipment through crowded hallways, and the distinct sound of multiple patients screaming in pain. Dr. Helena Cross, the night shift attending, spotted Sarah immediately. "Reeves, thank God! We need you in Trauma 2 right now." Sarah didn't ask questions. She grabbed a fresh pair of gloves from the wall dispenser and pushed through the growing crowd of staff members. Trauma 2 was already packed. A young woman on the gurney, maybe 25, with obvious crush injuries to her chest and abdomen. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, her skin gray. Two residents stood frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at the patient like they'd forgotten everything they'd learned in medical school. "Move!" Sarah's voice cut through their paralysis. She didn't wait for them to comply. She physically pushed past them and positioned herself at the head of the bed, her fingers already checking the woman's airway. "Diminished breath sounds on the right," she announced. "Probable pneumothorax. I need a chest tube kit and someone who knows how to use it." One of the residents finally snapped out of it. "Dr. Cross is not here. I am. Get me the kit." The resident ran. Sarah kept working, her hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that came from treating wounds in places where hesitation meant death. She'd done this exact procedure in the back of a medical tent while mortar rounds landed close enough to shake the walls. A well-lit hospital trauma bay was practically luxury. The patient's lips were turning blue. "Where's my chest tube?" Sarah's voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise. A nurse Sarah didn't recognize appeared with the kit. Sarah ripped it open, her muscle memory taking over. Find the landmark, make the incision. Blunt dissection through the muscle, into the pleural space. The patient gasped as air rushed out of the tube, her oxygen saturation already starting to climb on the monitor. Bag her, 20 breaths per minute. Someone get me a blood gas and cross her for 6 units. Sarah glanced up and saw Detective Walsh standing in the trauma bay doorway, staring at her with an expression that might have been shock or respect or both. Behind him, Tang had appeared as well, his earlier confidence completely gone. But Sarah didn't have time to process their presence because the radio crackled again. Incoming, multiple GSWs. Shooter still active in the vehicle bay. Gunshots echoed through the hospital. Someone screamed, and everything went to hell at once. The first gunshot sounded like a firecracker, distant, almost unreal. The second one was close enough that Sarah felt it in her chest, a sharp crack that made the windows in Trauma 2 rattle. "Everybody down!" Walsh's voice cut through the confusion as he drew his weapon and moved toward the hallway. His partner was already on the radio, calling for backup, his words clipped and urgent. Sarah didn't drop. Her hand stayed on the patient's chest tube, securing it in place even as nurses around her ducked behind equipment. In Kandahar, she'd learned that panicking was what got people killed. Stopping treatment was what turned survivable injuries into body bags. "I need someone to hold pressure here," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. A young nurse, couldn't have been more than 23, crawled forward on her knees and took over, her hand shaking but functional. Another shot, closer. Someone in the main hallway screamed. Dr. Cross burst into the trauma bay, her face pale. "We're going into lockdown. All patients need to be moved to..." This one can't be moved. She's got a chest tube and she's not stable." Sarah was already assessing her options. The trauma bay had one exit, which meant they were trapped if the shooter came this direction. "How many entrances to this wing?" 3. The main hallway, the ambulance bay, and the staff corridor. Cross looked like she was on the verge of falling apart. She was a good doctor in normal circumstances, but this was about as far from normal as it got. Sarah's mind switched into tactical mode, the same mental shift that had kept her alive when her convoy got ambushed outside Mosul. Lock down the ambulance bay, get security to seal the staff corridor. That leaves one approach vector, and we can monitor it from here. "Security?" Tang's voice came from the doorway, dripping with sarcasm despite the situation. "That's me, sweetheart, and I don't take orders from nurses." Sarah turned to look at him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. "Then get out of the way and let the people who actually know what they're doing handle this." Another gunshot, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Walsh reappeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Shooter's in the main lobby. We've got 2 officers engaging, but he's armed with what looks like an AR-15 and he's firing at anything that moves." "Casualties?" Sarah asked. "At least 3 down in the lobby. Maybe more." Walsh looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "Can you help them?" "Not if I leave this patient. She codes without monitoring." Sarah grabbed the resident who'd been standing uselessly in the corner. "You, what's your name?" "Dr. Kimball, first year, BE." "I don't care. You're about to get a crash course in combat medicine. Grab every trauma kit you can carry and follow Detective Walsh to the lobby. You're going to stabilize anyone who's bleeding while the police clear the threat." Kimball's eyes went wide. "I can't. I've never..." "You went to medical school. You know how to stop bleeding. Everything else is just noise." Sarah pulled him close enough that only he could hear. "People are dying right now while you're standing here being scared. Move." Something in her voice, maybe the absolute certainty, maybe the edge of command that came from years of giving orders under fire, made him nod. He grabbed 2 trauma bags from the supply cabinet and followed Walsh into the hallway. Dr. Cross stepped forward. "Reeves, you can't just send a first-year resident into an active shooter situation. Would you prefer I go? Because this patient will die if I leave, and then you get to explain to her family why you prioritized protocol over saving lives." Sarah didn't raise her voice, but the words landed like a slap. Cross opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out without another word. The young nurse holding pressure on the chest tube looked up at Sarah with something between terror and awe. "Is it always like this for you?" "No." Sarah checked the patient's vitals, blood pressure stabilizing, oxygen saturation climbing back into the safe zone. "Sometimes it's worse." More gunshots echoed from somewhere deep in the hospital. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Sarah could hear shouting, the sound of people running, and underneath it all the steady beep of medical monitors keeping track of hearts that were still beating. Her radio crackled. All units, suspect is mobile, heading toward the east wing. That was the surgical floor, where they'd have post-op patients still under anesthesia, unable to run, unable to hide. Sarah made a decision that probably violated a dozen hospital policies. You, she pointed at the young nurse. Your name? Jessica. Jessica, this patient is stable for now. If her O2 drops below 90%, increase the oxygen flow. If she starts bleeding from the tube site, apply direct pressure. If she stops breathing, bag her and scream for help. Can you do that? Jessica nodded, looking like she might throw up, but determined not to. Good. Sarah grabbed a fresh trauma kit and headed for the door. Tang stepped in front of her, trying to reclaim some of his earlier authority. Where do you think you're going? To do my job. Move. You're not security. You're not law enforcement. You stay here. Sarah looked at him with the kind of cold assessment she usually reserved for evaluating mass casualty scenes. In the last 20 minutes, you called the police on me for sitting in a parking lot, accused me of stealing drugs, and now you're trying to stop me from helping patients during a mass shooting. How many mistakes are you planning to make in one night? Tang's face flushed red. You don't get to talk to me like Marcus. Dr. Cross had reappeared, her earlier uncertainty replaced with something harder. Let her go. We need everyone who can help. For a second, Sarah thought Tang might actually try to physically stop her. His hand moved toward the pepper spray on his belt, and she saw Walsh tense in her peripheral vision, ready to intervene. Then the decision was made for all of them. A woman's voice screamed from somewhere down the east corridor. He's here! Oh God, he's... The scream cut off with a gunshot. Sarah was moving before the echo faded. She'd spent 3 years training her body to react faster than her brain could process fear, and that training took over now. The east corridor stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh white light. She could see overturned equipment carts, scattered medical supplies, and dark streaks on the floor that she tried not to look at too closely. Walsh caught up to her halfway down the hall, his weapon drawn. You should stay back. People are bleeding. That's my specialty. Sarah didn't slow down. You handle the shooting part. I'll handle the not dying part. They rounded the corner together and found chaos. The surgical wing's main nurse station was a disaster. Computers shot to pieces, papers scattered everywhere, and 3 people on the floor. One was clearly dead, a security guard with a wound to the chest that no amount of medicine would fix. The other 2 were still moving. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the nearest victim, a middle-aged woman in surgical scrubs with blood pouring from her shoulder. Can you hear me? The woman's eyes focused on Sarah, filled with pain and terror. He shot me. That kid just shot me. I don't understand. I know, stay still. Sarah ripped open the trauma kit and pulled out gauze and pressure bandages. The wound was ugly, but not immediately fatal. Through and through, missed the major vessels. This is going to hurt. She packed the wound without ceremony, ignoring the woman's scream. Comfort came later. Survival came first. Walsh was checking the 3rd victim, a younger man who looked like an orderly. He's unconscious, breathing, but there's a head wound. Roll him on his side in case he vomits. Keep his airway clear. Sarah finished bandaging the shoulder wound and moved to the orderly. The head wound looked worse than it was, probably pistol whipped rather than shot, based on the pattern. Still bad, still dangerous, but survivable if they got him to CT fast enough. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway. Walsh's weapon came up instantly, and Sarah found herself automatically calculating angles and cover, her old training overlaying reality like a tactical map. But it was just Dr. Kimball, looking shaken but functional. The lobby's clear. Officers got the shooter cornered in the pharmacy. But there's... He stopped, staring at the dead security guard. There's what? Walsh's voice was sharp. There's a second shooter. Someone radioed that they heard shots from the parking garage. Sarah's blood went cold. The parking garage, where her car was, where she'd been sitting not 20 minutes ago, trying to process the stress of a normal shift before everything went to hell. Walsh was already on his radio, coordinating with the other officers. Sarah turned to Kimball. Can you handle these 2? The shoulder wound needs surgery, but she's stable for transport. The head injury needs a CT scan and neuromonitoring. I think so, yes. Kimball knelt beside the injured woman, his hands steadier now that he had something concrete to do. Sarah stood up, her scrubs now covered in fresh blood to add to the dried stains from earlier. She could feel exhaustion creeping back in around the edges of her adrenaline, threatening to drag her down, but she shoved it aside. There'd be time to fall apart later. The radio crackled again. Second suspect is down. Repeat, second suspect is down. Jesus, he's just a kid, maybe 16. Someone get a medic to the garage level 2. Sarah and Walsh locked eyes. Without a word, they both started running. The parking garage was a concrete maze of shadows and yellow sodium lights. Sarah could smell gunpowder and something else. Copper, blood, the scent of violence. They found the scene on the second level near the stairwell entrance. 2 officers stood over a crumpled figure on the ground. The kid was maybe 17, his face smooth and young despite the tactical vest he wore and the rifle lying a few feet away. Blood spread beneath him from multiple wounds. The officers had lit him up when he'd raised his weapon, but he was still breathing. "Medics 5 minutes out," one of the officers said, looking pale. "We called as soon as—" Sarah was already down beside the kid, her hands moving automatically to assess the damage. 3 entry wounds that she could see: chest, abdomen, upper thigh. The chest wound was sucking, air bubbling through with each breath. The abdominal wound was bleeding steady but not spurting. The leg wound had probably nicked his femoral artery based on the amount of blood. "I need occlusive dressing, trauma gauze, and a tourniquet. Now." Walsh handed her his personal IFAC, individual first aid kit, the kind that cops carried for exactly this scenario. Sarah ripped it open and started working, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer surreal nature of what she was doing. An hour ago, she'd been harassed and searched by these same officers. Now she was trying to save the life of someone who'd just tried to kill people in her hospital. The kid's eyes flickered open, unfocused and glassy. Did we? Don't talk. Save your strength." Sarah sealed the chest wound with an occlusive patch and moved to the leg, tightening the tourniquet high on his thigh. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. "He doesn't deserve help." Tang's voice came from behind her, cold and flat. "He must have followed them from the surgical wing. He came here to murder people. Let him bleed out." Sarah didn't look up from her work. "That's not how this works. He tried to kill us. And now he's a patient. That's how this works." Sarah finished packing the abdominal wound and started an IV line, her fingers finding the vein on the second try despite the kid's thready pulse. "Get me O negative from the blood bank. 2 units to start." Nobody moved. Sarah looked up, and the expression on her face made 3 armed officers take a step back. "Someone get me blood, or I swear to God I will make sure everyone here knows you stood around while a patient died because you decided you were judge and jury." One of the younger officers broke first, practically running toward the stairwell that would take him to the main hospital. The kid coughed, blood flecking his lips. "I'm sorry, I didn't. He said it would be easy. He said—" "Who said?" Walsh knelt on the other side of the kid, his cop instincts overriding everything else. "Who planned this?" But the kid's eyes were rolling back, his breathing getting shallower. Sarah checked his pulse, weak, fast, irregular. He was going into shock despite everything she'd done. "Forget questions. He needs surgery now or he's dead." The medics arrived then, a 2-person team with a stretcher and proper equipment. Sarah gave them a rapid-fire rundown, injuries, treatment, vitals, while they got the kid loaded and ready for transport. They were moving within 90 seconds, racing back toward the ER where a surgical team was supposedly prepping an OR. Sarah stayed behind in the parking garage, sitting on the cold concrete with blood on her hands and exhaustion finally catching up to her in waves. Walsh stood a few feet away, looking at her like he was trying to solve a complicated equation. "You saved him," Walsh said finally. "After everything that just happened, you saved the person who tried to kill your co-workers." "That's the job. That's not— most people wouldn't—" Walsh stopped, seeming to search for words. "In the parking lot earlier. I owe you an apology." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think?" "Tang called in a complaint about a suspicious person. We responded. We had no idea, that I was a human being? That I might have a legitimate reason to be sitting in my own car?" Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady. "You didn't ask questions. You just assumed he was right and I was wrong. You searched me without cause, dumped my belongings on the hood of my car, and the only reason you backed off was because I had a military ID. What if I didn't? What if I was just a regular nurse who'd never served? Would you still have humiliated me and walked away? Walsh opened his mouth, closed it. He had no answer, and they both knew it. More sirens were approaching. State police, probably, or FBI. Mass shootings at hospitals meant federal involvement, which meant reports and interviews and hours of questions that Sarah didn't have the energy to answer. She started walking toward the stairwell, leaving bloody footprints on the concrete. "Where are you going?" Walsh called after her. "Back to work. I've still got patients." The ER had transformed into something out of a disaster movie. Every bay was full. Every available staff member was covered in blood, and the waiting room had been converted into an overflow triage area where less critical patients waited on folding chairs while the serious cases got rushed to surgery. Sarah found Dr. Cross in the central hub, coordinating assignments with a whiteboard and a phone pressed to each ear. She looked up as Sarah approached, and relief flooded her features. "Reeves. Thank God. I need you in OR 2. The chest tube patient from earlier is crashing, and the attending got called away to another critical case." Sarah wanted to point out that she'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, that she was covered in blood from multiple patients, that she'd just treated both the victims and perpetrator of a mass shooting and maybe deserved a minute to process that. But there were people dying, and personal comfort had never been part of the equation. "I'm on it." She scrubbed in quickly, the hot water turning pink as it washed away layers of blood. The face staring back at her in the mirror above the sink looked haggard, older than 33, with dark circles under eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. Or 2 was standard surgical chaos, nurses calling out vitals, the anesthesiologist adjusting medication, and on the table, the young woman from earlier whose crushed chest had been stabilized, but whose internal injuries apparently ran deeper than anyone had realized. Dr. Helena Cross was already gowned and gloved, working with rapid precision to repair a torn section of lung tissue. She glanced up as Sarah entered. "I need another pair of hands. She's bleeding faster than we can replace it." Sarah stepped up to the table without hesitation. This was familiar ground, assisting in emergency surgery while someone's life hung in the balance. She'd done this in field hospitals with mortars landing close enough to rattle the surgical instruments, had performed procedures in the back of moving vehicles with nothing but a headlamp and prayer. A fully equipped OR was practically luxury. "Suction here," Cross directed, and Sarah complied, clearing blood from the surgical field so Cross could see what she was doing. The minutes blurred together into a rhythm of commands and responses, hands moving in synchronized coordination that came from years of training and too much experience with situations where mistakes meant death. The woman's vitals started to stabilize. Her oxygen saturation climbed back into safe territory. The bleeding slowed to a manageable trickle. Cross stepped back, breathing hard behind her surgical mask. "That should hold. Let's close her up and get her to ICU." They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, suturing layers of tissue with meticulous care. It was only when they'd finished and the patient was being wheeled away that Cross pulled down her mask and really looked at Sarah. "That was good work. Really good. Where'd you learn to assist like that?" "Army field hospitals. You learn fast when there's no one else to call." Cross nodded slowly. "I heard what happened in the parking lot earlier. Before all of this." Sarah's hand stilled as she stripped off her bloody gloves. "Yeah? Tang filed a complaint against you, said you were insubordinate and potentially under the influence. He wants you suspended, pending investigation." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. The injustice of it hit her like a physical blow. She'd just helped save dozens of lives during a mass shooting, had treated everyone from victims to perpetrators without discrimination, had worked for nearly 24 hours straight, and the man who'd started this whole nightmare was trying to destroy her career. "When?" Her voice came out flat, emotionless. "He filed it 20 minutes ago while you were in surgery. Administration is reviewing it now." Cross peeled off her own gloves and tossed them in the biohazard bin. "For what it's worth, I'm filing a counter report. What you did tonight, most people would have run. You stayed and fought and saved lives that would have been lost without you. Will it matter?" "I don't know. Tang has seniority, he's got friends in administration, and you—" Cross hesitated. "I'm just a nurse who talks back." Sarah finished the sentence with bitter accuracy. "I get it. The system protects people like him. She walked out of the OR without waiting for a response. The hallways were quieter now. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving behind the grim work of cleanup and documentation. Sarah passed rooms where families were learning that their loved ones hadn't survived, where doctors were explaining the long road of recovery ahead, where nurses were quietly cleaning blood off floors and walls. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Need to speak with you ASAP. Detective Walsh. 614-555-0147. Sarah almost deleted it, almost. But something made her call the number instead. Walsh picked up on the first ring. Reeves, where are you? Hospital, where else would I be? I need you to come down to the station. We're interviewing everyone who had contact with the shooters. And you? I treated them. That's my contact. I don't know who they were or why they did this. It's not that simple. Walsh's voice dropped lower, like he was moving somewhere private to talk. The kid you saved? He's talking, and he's saying things that don't add up. Sarah's exhaustion was hitting critical levels now, making it hard to focus. What kind of things? He's saying this wasn't random, that they targeted this hospital specifically, and when we asked why, he mentioned something about hospital security being compromised. Walsh paused. He mentioned Tang by name. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Sarah leaned against the wall, her mind trying to process what she was hearing through the fog of fatigue. Tang knew about the shooting? We don't know yet. But the kid claims someone inside gave them the security codes, told them when shift changes happened, which entrances were least monitored. We're pulling security footage now, and... Walsh stopped abruptly. Someone's coming. I have to go. But Reeves, watch your back. If Tang is involved in this somehow, and he knows you're the one who saved the kid who can testify against him. The line went dead. Sarah stood alone in the hallway, blood dried on her scrubs, body screaming for rest, and mind racing with implications she didn't want to believe. Tang had harassed her, called the police on her, accused her of crimes she hadn't committed, and now possibly tried to file a complaint to get her suspended. And all of that had happened before she'd saved the life of someone who could destroy him. She needed to leave, get in her car, drive home, lock the door, and process everything that had happened. But when she made her way back to the parking garage, she found her Honda Civic sitting exactly where she'd left it. Except now someone had smashed the driver's side window and slashed all 4 tires. Written on the windshield in what looked like red spray paint were 4 words. You should have run. Sarah stood in the parking garage staring at the vandalized car, her exhausted brain trying to process the threat through layers of fatigue that made everything feel distant and unreal. The red paint was still wet, dripping down the windshield in streaks that looked too much like blood. Her phone was already in her hand, Walsh's number on the screen, but she stopped before hitting call. Someone had done this in the last hour, maybe less. Someone who knew which car was hers, who had access to this parking garage, who wanted her scared enough to leave. Tang had that access. So did half the hospital staff. She took photos instead. The slashed tires, the broken window, the message. Documentation. Evidence. The same instinct that had made her start recording in her car earlier tonight, before everything spiraled out of control. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Sarah's body tensed automatically, her mind cataloging exits and improvised weapons. A tire iron was still visible in her trunk through the broken window. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Dr. Cross emerged from the shadows, still in her surgical scrubs, moving with the cautious energy of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for too long. She stopped when she saw Sarah's car, her expression shifting from concern to anger. When did this happen? Sometime in the last hour. I was in surgery. Sarah's voice sounded flat even to her own ears, shock setting in now that the immediate crisis had passed. Cross walked around the vehicle, examining the damage with the same clinical assessment she'd use on a patient. The security cameras should have caught this. The garage is monitored 24/7. You think Tang's going to let us see that footage? Tang doesn't control the security system. IT does. And the head of IT owes me a favor after I saved his kid from appendicitis last month. Cross pulled out her phone. Give me 10 minutes. She walked away, already dialing. Sarah slumped against the concrete pillar next to her ruined car, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Her hands were shaking again, Delayed stress response. She recognized it clinically even as she experienced it. The body's way of processing trauma after the immediate danger had passed. Except the danger hadn't passed. Someone had just threatened her. Someone who knew where she worked, what she drove, and wanted her gone badly enough to vandalize hospital property. Her phone buzzed. A text from Walsh. "Are you still at the hospital?" Sarah typed back. "Parking garage. Someone destroyed my car." The response came within seconds. "Don't move. I'm 5 minutes away." She waited, sitting on the cold concrete floor with her back against the pillar, watching the entrance to the garage. The sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear sirens, probably more police arriving to process the shooting scene, or maybe FBI. Big enough incident, the feds always showed up. Walsh arrived in 4 minutes, not 5. He came in fast, his unmarked cruiser's lights flashing, and he was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. Another officer was with him, a woman Sarah didn't recognize, older and harder looking than most of the cops she'd dealt with tonight. "Reeves." Walsh took in the scene with a cop's practiced eye, immediately photographing everything with his phone. "You touch anything?" "Just took pictures. Didn't want to contaminate evidence." The other officer circled the car, her expression unreadable. "Message is pretty clear. Someone wants you scared." "It's working." Walsh turned to look at Sarah, and something in his face had changed since earlier. The casual authority was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "The kid, the shooter you saved, his name is Dylan Marsh, 17 years old, junior at Westfield High. He's in surgery now, but before they put him under, he gave us names." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Tang?" "Among others. Marsh claims he was recruited 3 months ago by someone who worked security at Mercy Ridge. Said they were part of some online group that planned attacks on hospitals they deemed corrupt. The security contact gave them floor plans, shift schedules, and codes to bypass certain entrances. The other officer spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of years in law enforcement. "I'm Detective Lisa Brennan, Internal Affairs. We've been investigating Marcus Tang for 6 months based on complaints from hospital staff. Nothing stuck because witnesses kept recanting or disappearing from the complaint process." She looked directly at Sarah. "You're the first person who's fought back and had the credentials to make people listen." "I didn't fight back. I did my job." "You recorded him. You documented everything. And then you saved the life of someone who can put him in prison." Brennan pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of screenshots, text messages between Tang and an unknown number, discussing tonight's event and clearing obstacles. "We pulled these from Tang's phone an hour ago. The timestamps match up with when he called Walsh to report you as suspicious." Sarah stared at the messages, her tired brain struggling to connect the pieces. "He called the police on me to get me away from the hospital before the shooting started." "That's our working theory. You were an unknown variable, former military, trauma training, someone who might actually be able to stop what was about to happen. So he tried to remove you from the board. But I came back." The realization hit Sarah like cold water. "I came back, and then I saved Dylan, and now Dylan's talking." Walsh nodded grimly. "And Tang knows it, which is why you need protective custody until we can bring him in." "Where is he now?" "We don't know. He left the hospital about 40 minutes ago, and he's not answering his phone. We've got units checking his apartment and known associates, but—" Walsh stopped, his radio crackling to life. The dispatcher's voice was urgent. "All units. We have a reported hostage situation at Mercy Ridge Hospital, surgical wing. Suspect is armed and has barricaded himself with hospital staff. Suspect is identified as Marcus Tang, hospital security." Sarah was on her feet before Walsh could stop her. "What floor?" "Reeves. You're not— What floor?" Her voice cut like a blade. Brennan checked her tablet. "4th floor surgical wing, ICU section." She looked up, her expression grim. "That's where they took the shooting victims, including the ones you saved." Sarah was already running toward the stairwell. Behind her, she heard Walsh cursing and Brennan calling for backup, but she didn't slow down. 4 floors of stairs, taking them 2 at a time, her exhausted muscles screaming in protest. The stairwell door burst open on the 4th floor, and she nearly collided with a group of nurses evacuating in controlled panic. "What's happening?" Sarah grabbed the nearest one, a woman she recognized from night shifts. "Tang went crazy. He's got a gun. He locked himself in ICU 4 with Dr. Cross and 2 patients." The nurse's voice was shaking. He's saying he'll kill them if anyone tries to come in. Sarah's blood went cold. ICU-4 was where they'd sent the young woman with the chest tube, her patient from earlier, the one who'd survived crush injuries only to end up trapped with a man who'd helped orchestrate a mass shooting. The fourth-floor hallway was chaos. Police were setting up a perimeter. Hospital security was evacuating nearby rooms, and administrators were arguing with officers about jurisdiction and protocol. Sarah pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouts for her to stay back. Walsh caught up to her halfway down the hall. "You can't go in there. He's got my patient, and he's got a hostage negotiator on the way. SWAT's 15 minutes out. We do this by the book. Your book got 3 people shot in the parking lot earlier." Sarah kept moving toward ICU-4. Through the windows, she could see Tang inside, pacing like a caged animal, a pistol in his hand. Dr. Cross was backed against the wall near the patient monitors, her hands raised. 2 patients were visible in their beds, connected to machines that beeped rhythmically, oblivious to the danger. A senior officer, Captain Somebody, Sarah didn't catch the name, was shouting into a phone pressed against the ICU door. "Marcus, you need to calm down. Nobody else has to get hurt." Tang's voice came through muffled but audible. "I want a car, and I want that nurse, Reeves. She testifies. I'm done. I want her here now, or I start shooting patients." The hallway went silent. Every eye turned toward Sarah. Walsh stepped between her and the door. "Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with—" "He'll kill them." Sarah's voice was calm, clinically detached. "You know he will. He's already facing life in prison for conspiracy to commit mass murder. What's 3 more bodies? SWAT will breach in 15 minutes. Those patients don't have 15 minutes. One of them is barely stable. Any stress and she could code." Sarah looked past Walsh to the captain. "I'm going in. Miss Reeves, I can't authorize—" "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you I'm going in there. Or you can arrest me and let those people die while you fill out paperwork." Sarah pulled off her bloody scrub top, revealing the plain tank top underneath. Easier to move, harder to grab, old habits from combat zones. "Tell him I'm unarmed. Tell him I'll come in alone. But I'm going in." Brennan appeared at her elbow. She's former military, trained for hostage situations, and Tang specifically asked for her. She looked at Sarah with something that might have been admiration or might have been pity. "You sure about this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The captain made a decision that would probably cost him his job later. He nodded once, then spoke into the phone. "Marcus? She's coming in, alone and unarmed. You let the patients go, we can talk about that car." Tang's laugh sounded unhinged even through the door. "The patients stay. She comes in, or I shoot the doctor. You've got 30 seconds. Sarah was already moving to the door. Walsh grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "He's going to kill you. You know that, right?" "Maybe, but maybe I can buy enough time for your SWAT team to do their job." She pulled free and knocked on the ICU door. "Tang, it's Reeves." "I'm opening the door." The lock clicked from inside. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, hands visible, and stepped into the ICU room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Tang looked worse than she'd ever seen him. His security uniform was disheveled, his eyes too bright, and his hands shook as he pointed the gun at her. Behind him, Dr. Cross was frozen against the monitors, and the 2 patients, the young woman with the chest tube and an older man Sarah didn't recognize, were awake and terrified. "Close the door." Sarah closed it. The sound of the lock engaging was unnaturally loud. "You couldn't just leave it alone?" Tang's voice cracked. "You had to be the hero. You had to save that kid." "That's my job." "Your job?" He laughed again, that same unhinged sound. "You know what my job was? Keep the hospital safe. 9 years I worked here. 9 years of dealing with entitled doctors and nurses who treated me like furniture. You know how many times I got thanked? How many times someone acknowledged that I was the one keeping them safe?" Sarah kept her voice level, the same tone she'd use with a patient in shock. "You helped orchestrate a mass shooting, Marcus. You gave criminals the tools to murder people. I gave them access to a corrupt system. This hospital's been covering up malpractice for years. Deaths that could have been prevented. Mistakes that got buried in paperwork. Someone needed to expose it. So you helped kill innocent people?" "There are no innocent people here." Tang's shout made Dr. Cross flinch. "Everyone who works at Mercy Ridge is complicit. The administrators who hide mistakes, the doctors who cover for each other, the nurses who—" He stopped, breathing hard. You were supposed to be gone. I called the cops on you to get you away before it started. You weren't supposed to come back. But I did. And I saved Dylan Marsh. And now he's telling the police everything. Tang's gun hand steadied, pointing directly at Sarah's chest. Which is why you're not leaving this room alive. The patient monitors beeped steadily in the background. Sarah calculated angles, distances, the time it would take Tang to pull the trigger versus the time it would take her to close the gap between them. She'd done close-quarters combat training in the Army, had disarmed combatants in situations more dangerous than this. But she'd also been younger then, and rested, and not operating on 26 hours without sleep. If you shoot me, SWAT breaches immediately and you die. Sarah took a small step forward. But if you let everyone go, you've got leverage. You've got me as a hostage, and you can walk out of here. I'm not stupid. The moment I step outside, they'll shoot me. Maybe. Or maybe you get your car and your head start. You've got nothing to lose by trying. Tang's eyes narrowed. Why are you helping me? I'm not helping you. I'm trying to save my patient. Sarah gestured toward the young woman in the bed, whose heart rate was climbing on the monitor, stress response to the situation, pushing her already fragile system. She needs to get out of here before her condition deteriorates. She stays. Then let Dr. Cross go. You don't need 2 hostages. For a moment, Sarah thought he might actually consider it. His gun lowered slightly and Cross took a half step toward the door. Then Tang's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out one-handed, keeping the gun trained on Sarah. His face went pale as he read whatever was on the screen. They found it. They found everything. His voice was barely a whisper. My computer, the chat logs, the bank transfers. He looked up at Sarah with eyes that had gone dead. I'm done. Marcus, shut up. The gun came back up, steady now, aimed at Sarah's head. You should have run. In the parking lot, when I gave you the chance, you should have just left. I don't run. Then you die. The door exploded inward. SWAT had apparently decided not to wait the full 15 minutes. Flashbangs detonated with sounds that felt like physical blows, light strobing through the room bright enough to burn. Sarah dropped and rolled left on pure instinct, her hands going up to protect her face from the debris. Gunshots, 3, 4, 5 in rapid succession. Someone screamed. When the chaos cleared, Tang was on the floor with 3 holes in his chest, eyes staring at nothing. A SWAT officer stood over him, rifle still aimed, while 2 others rushed to secure the room. Dr. Cross was on the floor near the monitors, uninjured but shaking. The older male patient was crying, hands over his ears, and the young woman with the chest tube was flatlining. Sarah was moving before conscious thought caught up. She shoved past the SWAT officer and hit the code button on the wall, then started chest compressions. The woman's sternum flexed under her hands, and Sarah counted the rhythm automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get crash cart, she shouted at no one in particular. Dr. Cross pulled herself up, still shaking but functional. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles from the cart a nurse had rushed in. Clear, Sarah pulled back. The shock made the woman's body jerk. The monitor stayed flat. Again! Cross charged the paddles. Clear! Another shock. The line jumped, stuttered, then settled into a rhythm. Sarah checked the chest tube, still secure, no new bleeding. The woman's color was improving, oxygen saturation climbing. The code had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Cross leaned against the wall, breathing hard. She's stable. You can stop compressions. Sarah sat back on her heels, her arms trembling from exertion and adrenaline crash. Around her, the room was organized chaos, police securing Tang's body, SWAT clearing the space, nurses checking the other patient, administrators appearing with clipboards and concerned expressions. Walsh pushed through the crowd and pulled Sarah to her feet. Are you hurt? No. The word came out distant. She was looking at Tang's body on the floor, at the man who'd tried to kill her and her patients, whose crusade against perceived corruption had turned him into exactly the kind of monster he claimed to be fighting. Brennan was already examining Tang's phone, her expression grim. We've got everything. Chat logs going back 6 months. He was connected to a network of disgruntled security personnel across the country, planning attacks on hospitals they deemed failing patients. Mercy Ridge was supposed to be the first. How many others? Sarah heard herself ask. At least 4 more hospitals on their target list. But Dylan Marsh's testimony and this phone will shut down the entire network. Brennan looked up. You saved a lot of lives tonight, Reeves. More than you know. Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt exhausted and nauseous and angry at a system that had allowed someone like Tang to get this far, to weaponize his grievances into mass murder. I need to sit down. Walsh guided her to a chair in the hallway while the crime scene team moved in. Other officers were taking statements from witnesses. Hospital administrators were arguing about liability and procedures. The normal bureaucratic response to crisis was already kicking in, everyone protecting their own interests. Cross appeared with a bottle of water and a protein bar. Eat. You look like you're about to pass out. Sarah took them mechanically. The water tasted like plastic. The protein bar might as well have been cardboard. But she forced them down anyway because Cross was right. She was running on empty, and her body needed fuel. The hospital board wants to meet with you, Cross said quietly. Tomorrow morning. They're calling it a debriefing, but it's probably about Tang's complaint against you. He helped orchestrate a mass shooting, and they're still taking his complaint seriously? Welcome to hospital administration, where protecting the institution matters more than protecting the people who work for it. Cross's bitterness was palpable. But for what it's worth, I'm testifying on your behalf. So are about a dozen other staff members who saw what you did tonight. Sarah closed her eyes. She wanted to go home, to sleep for about 3 days straight, to forget this entire nightmare had happened. But she knew that wasn't how this worked. There would be meetings and depositions and interviews. There would be internal investigations and external reviews. The bureaucracy would grind on regardless of the human cost. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but this time the area code was local. She answered without thinking. Miss Reeves? This is Jennifer Castillo with Channel 7 News. We're running a story about tonight's events at Mercy Ridge Hospital, and we'd like to get a statement from you about... Sarah hung up. The phone buzzed again immediately. Different number, probably different news outlet. She turned it off and shoved it in her pocket. They're going to make this a story, she said to no one in particular. Hero nurse stops mass shooting. Former soldier saves the day. They'll turn it into something clean and simple because that's easier than dealing with the mess underneath. Walsh sat down beside her. You're not wrong. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Public pressure might force some actual changes. Better security protocols, better oversight of who gets hired, better protection for staff who report problems. Or it'll blow over in a week and everything goes back to how it was. Sarah's cynicism felt earned after the night she'd had. They sat in silence for a while, watching the organized chaos of a major crime scene being processed. Eventually, Brennan approached with a tablet and a stylus. I need your statement. Everything from when you arrived for your shift until now. It took an hour to walk through everything. Sarah's exhaustion made it hard to keep events straight. What happened before the shooting versus during versus after. Brennan was patient, prompting her with questions, cross-referencing with other witnesses' statements. By the time they finished, Sarah's voice was hoarse and her eyes were burning. That's good for now. We'll probably need follow-up interviews as the investigation continues, but you're free to go. Brennan hesitated. You should know. The kid, Dylan Marsh. He's out of surgery. Doctors say he'll make it. Sarah didn't know how to feel about that. Relief that she'd saved a life, even one that had tried to take others. Anger that he'd get to live while his victims might not. The moral calculus was too complicated for her exhausted brain to process. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. Cross appeared at her side, offering support. Come on, I'll drive you home. My car is evidence now, and even if it wasn't, you're not driving on 4 flat tires. Cross guided her toward the elevator. Where do you live? Sarah gave her the address, and they rode down in silence. The ER was still busy, but noticeably calmer than it had been hours ago. The shooting victims had all been treated, stabilized, or transferred. The dead had been moved to the morgue. The chaos had settled into the routine aftermath of tragedy. Cross's car was a sensible sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and hand sanitizer. She drove carefully through the pre-dawn streets of Columbus, following Sarah's directions to a modest apartment complex in a neighborhood that was trying hard to be middle class. Thank you, Sarah said as they pulled into the parking lot, for everything tonight. Thank you for not letting me fall apart when it mattered. Cross's hands were still gripping the steering wheel tight enough that her knuckles were white. I froze in that ICU room, When Tang pulled the gun, I completely froze. You saved my life. You would have done the same for me. I hope so, but I'm not sure. Cross finally let go of the wheel and turned to look at Sarah. What you did tonight, going into that room knowing he might kill you, that's not normal. That's not what most people would do. I'm not most people. No, you're really not. Cross pulled out a business card and handed it over. That's my personal cell. If you need anything at all, you call me. I mean it. Sarah took the card and climbed out of the car. Her apartment was on the second floor, and the stairs felt like climbing a mountain. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it yesterday morning before her shift. Dishes in the sink, laundry half folded on the couch, her cat meowing indignantly about the delayed breakfast. She fed the cat, stripped off her bloody scrubs, and stood under scalding water in the shower until it ran cold. The blood wouldn't come out of her skin no matter how hard she scrubbed. It was psychological, she knew. The blood was long gone. But she could still feel it, sticky and warm, marking her as someone who'd been too close to death too many times. Finally, she collapsed into bed. Her phone, turned back on out of habit, showed 47 missed calls and over 100 text messages. News outlets mostly, but also numbers she didn't recognize. People who'd somehow gotten her contact information and wanted a piece of her story. She was about to turn the phone off again when one message caught her eye. From a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Miss Reeves, this is Colonel Patricia Vance, U.S. Army Medical Command. We need to discuss your actions tonight. Please call at your earliest convenience. This is urgent. Sarah stared at the message, her exhausted brain trying to understand why the Army would be contacting her 3 years after her discharge. She started to type a response, then stopped. Her apartment door handle was turning slowly, carefully, like someone was trying to open it without making noise. Sarah rolled off the bed silently, her body moving on instinct before her conscious mind fully processed the threat. The door handle stopped turning. Whoever was out there had realized the lock was engaged. She grabbed her phone and the baseball bat she kept in the corner, a relic from her college softball days that had traveled with her through 3 deployments and every apartment since. Her hands were steady now, the exhaustion pushed aside by adrenaline that her body somehow still had reserves of. A soft knock. Miss Reeves, it's Detective Walsh. I know you're home. Dr. Cross told me she dropped you off. Sarah moved to the door and looked through the peephole. Walsh stood in the hallway, alone, his hands visible and empty. He looked as exhausted as she felt. She opened the door but kept the chain engaged. It's 5 a.m. I know, I'm sorry, but we have a situation and it involves you directly. Walsh held up his badge like she might have forgotten who he was. Can I come in? This isn't a conversation for hallways. Sarah studied his face through the gap. Whatever this was, it had him rattled. She unhooked the chain and stepped back, bat still in hand. Walsh entered and closed the door behind him, engaging the deadbolt. That single action told Sarah more than words could. He was worried about someone following him. What situation? Walsh pulled out his phone and showed her a video. The footage was grainy, timestamp showing 3 hours ago. It showed Tang's apartment, federal agents executing a search warrant. But what held Sarah's attention was what they were pulling out. Boxes of files, hard drives, and a wall covered in photographs. Photographs of hospital staff, dozens of them. Sarah's own face appeared multiple times, leaving the hospital, getting into her car, walking to her apartment. Some were weeks old based on her clothing. Tang had been documenting her movements for a long time. He was obsessed with you specifically, Walsh said quietly. We found journals, pages of notes about your schedule, your habits, your background. He knew about your military service before he called us to the parking lot. He knew exactly who you were. Sarah's stomach turned. Why? Because you were dangerous to his plan. Former combat medic, trauma training, someone who'd actually respond effectively in a crisis instead of panicking. He tried multiple times to get you fired over the past 6 months, filed complaints about minor infractions, accused you of protocol violations, but nothing stuck because you were too good at your job. So he escalated. He got desperate. The shooting was supposed to happen last night whether you were there or not, but having you removed beforehand was insurance, except you came back. Walsh swiped to another image. A text exchange between Tang and someone named Architect. The messages were chilling in their clinical detail about planned casualties and optimal timing. Sarah sat down on her couch, the bat across her lap. Who's architect? We don't know yet. The account's been scrubbed, routed through proxies across 4 countries. FBI's cyber division is working on it, but whoever set this up knew what they were doing. Walsh sat in the chair across from her. But here's the thing that made me drive over here at 5 a.m. We found another set of files, not on Tang's computer, on his phone, in a hidden folder he apparently forgot to delete. He pulled up more images. These were financial records, wire transfers, cryptocurrency transactions, amounts that made Sarah's eyes widen. Tang was being paid a lot. We're talking 6 figures over the last year, funneled through shell companies and crypto wallets. Someone bankrolled this entire operation, and they're still out there. You think they might come after me? I think you're the person who can identify Dylan Marsh's voice, confirm his testimony, and help us trace the network back to Architect, which makes you extremely valuable to the prosecution and extremely dangerous to whoever's funding this. Walsh leaned forward. I'm not here officially. My captain doesn't know I'm talking to you, but you need protection, and the department's stretched thin with the investigation. So what are you suggesting? That you disappear for a few days. Let us figure out who Architect is and make arrests before you become a target. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. I just spent 26 hours dealing with the consequences of running away from problems. I'm not starting now. This isn't about being brave. It's about being smart. Then be smart and catch whoever's behind this before they try something else. Sarah stood up, signaling the conversation was over. I appreciate the warning, but I'm not hiding. Walsh stood reluctantly. At least let me put a patrol car outside your building. Fine, but make it unmarked. I don't need my neighbors thinking I'm under investigation. After Walsh left, Sarah tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept seeing Tang's wall of photographs, the obsessive documentation of her life, the calculation behind every move he'd made. He hadn't acted alone, and whoever Architect was, they were still out there, still planning. Her phone buzzed with that DC number again. This time she answered. This is Reeves. Ms. Reeves, Colonel Patricia Vance, thank you for answering. The voice was crisp, authoritative, carrying the weight of command. I'm calling about the incident at Mercy Ridge Hospital. Your actions last night have drawn attention at very high levels. I was doing my job. Your job doesn't typically involve hostage negotiations and combat medicine under active threat conditions. But your military record suggests this isn't the first time you've exceeded expectations. Papers rustled on the other end. 3 deployments, Bronze Star, Combat Medical Badge, and an exemplary service record until your discharge, which raises the question of why you left. Sarah's jaw tightened. That's personal? It became professional the moment you started making national news. The Army is interested in bringing you back. Training instructor position at Fort Sam Houston, teaching the next generation of combat medics. Officer track, significant pay increase, and your pick of postings after the initial tour. I left for a reason, Colonel. I read the file. You lost 3 soldiers in an IED attack outside Kandahar. Your commanding officer cleared you of any wrongdoing, but you resigned anyway. Vance's voice softened slightly. PTSD is nothing to be ashamed of, Sergeant Reeves. I don't have PTSD. I left because I watched bureaucrats in safe offices make decisions that got my people killed, and I was tired of being part of that machine. Sarah's voice was colder than she intended. The Army's had 3 years to make this offer. Why now? Because now you've proven you're exactly what we need. Someone who acts decisively under pressure, who doesn't freeze when things get bad, who puts mission and people above personal safety. That video of you running back into an active shooting to treat victims, it's already gone viral. You're becoming a symbol whether you want to be or not. Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the unmarked police car Walsh had posted below. The sun was starting to rise, painting Columbus in shades of orange and gold. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. This offer expires when the media cycle moves on. Vance paused. And Ms. Reeves, watch your back. What you stumbled into last night, it's bigger than one angry security guard. People who plan operations like this don't stop because one piece got captured. The line went dead. Sarah stood at the window for a long time, watching the city wake up. Her phone kept buzzing with calls and messages she didn't answer. Finally, she gave up on sleep entirely, fed her cat again, and started going through the texts she'd ignored. Most were from news outlets offering interviews and exclusive stories. Several were from lawyers offering to represent her if she wanted to sue the hospital or the police department, but one message stood out, sent from an encrypted number at 4 a.m. "You don't know what you've cost us, but you will." Sarah screenshot the message and sent it to Walsh, then blocked the number. Her hands were shaking again, not fear, but rage. She was tired of being threatened by people who hid behind anonymous accounts and conspiracy theories, tired of being treated like a problem that needed to be eliminated. She showered, dressed in clean clothes, and made coffee strong enough to strip paint. By 7 a.m., she was sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop, doing what she should have done months ago, documenting everything. Every interaction with Tang. Every complaint she'd heard from other staff members about his behavior. Every time hospital administration had dismissed concerns or buried reports. She compiled it into a single document, backed it up to 3 different cloud services, and emailed copies to Walsh, Brennan, and Dr. Cross. Then she did something that would probably get her fired. She emailed it to the Columbus Dispatch investigative team. Her phone rang within 10 minutes. A reporter named Michael Torres, speaking fast like he was afraid she'd hang up. "Miss Reeves, I just read your email. If even half of this is true, we're looking at systemic failures going back years. It's all true, and I have documentation for most of it. Can we meet? I'd like to discuss this in person, maybe get your statement on record about what happened last night." Sarah hesitated. Going public meant burning bridges with Mercy Ridge, possibly making herself unemployable at other hospitals. But staying silent meant nothing would change, and the next Marcus Tang would slip through the cracks until he hurt someone else. Where and when? They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Sarah's apartment, chosen specifically because it was public and well lit. Torres was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with the eager intensity of someone who still believed journalism could change things. He had a recorder and a notepad, but he didn't turn on the recorder immediately. "Before we start officially, I need you to understand what you're doing. Once this story breaks, there's no walking it back. The hospital will come after you. So will their lawyers. Your life is about to get very complicated." "It's already complicated. Might as well make it count for something." Torres hit record. For the next 2 hours, Sarah walked him through everything. The harassment from Tang, the ignored complaints, the hospital administration's pattern of protecting problematic employees to avoid scandal. She gave him names, dates, specific incidents. She told him about the shooting, the hostage situation, and the discovery of Tang's larger network. Torres took notes furiously, occasionally stopping her to ask for clarification or additional details. When she finished, he sat back with an expression of someone who'd just been handed the story of his career. "This is going to explode. You know that, right?" "Good." "The hospital will deny everything. They'll call you disgruntled, claim you're making accusations to cover for something, drag your name through the mud. Let them try." Sarah finished her coffee, which had gone cold an hour ago. "I've got documentation, witnesses, and a dead security guard whose apartment was full of evidence. What do they have?" "Lawyers. Lots of lawyers." Torres closed his notebook. "But you've also got something they don't. Credibility. Former combat medic who saved lives during a mass shooting, then risked herself again to stop a hostage situation. That's not a profile that screams disgruntled employee." They exchanged contact information, and Torres promised to have a draft of the story by end of day. Sarah walked back to her apartment through morning rush hour, anonymous among the crowds of people heading to jobs and lives that didn't involve death threats and conspiracy networks. The unmarked police car was gone from outside her building. In its place sat a news van. Sarah cursed under her breath and tried to slip past, but a woman with a microphone intercepted her at the entrance. "Ms. Reeves, Jennifer Castillo, Channel 7. Can we get a statement about the events at Mercy Ridge Hospital?" No comment. Sarah tried to move past, but 2 more reporters materialized from nowhere, blocking her path. "Is it true you saved the life of one of the shooters? Did you know Marcus Tang was planning the attack? Our sources say you're being investigated for violations of hospital protocol." I said no comment. Sarah's voice went hard and cold. "Move." Something in her tone made them step back. She pushed through and into the building, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Her apartment door was undisturbed, but someone had slipped a note under it. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., Mercy Ridge Administration Building. Attendance mandatory. Hospital Board." Sarah crumpled the note and threw it across the room. Her cat watched with disinterest, then went back to sleep in a patch of sunlight. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls she didn't answer and messages she barely skimmed. The story was already spreading online, multiple videos from patients and staff who'd filmed parts of the shooting. In one shaky phone video, Sarah could be seen running toward Trauma 2 while everyone else was running away. In another, she was visible through the ICU window during the hostage situation, standing between Tang and Dr. Cross. The comment sections were predictably toxic. Half called her a hero. The other half questioned why she'd saved the shooter's life, accused her of being complicit, or suggested the whole thing was staged. The internet's capacity for conspiracy theories never failed to amaze her. By evening, the Columbus Dispatch had published Torres's story. The headline was deliberately understated. Mercy Ridge Hospital faces questions after security guards' role in mass shooting. But the article itself was devastating, laying out a timeline of ignored complaints, buried incidents, and systemic failures that had allowed Tang to operate unchecked for years. Within an hour, the hospital issued a statement denying any prior knowledge of Tang's activities and expressing full commitment to cooperating with law enforcement. The statement made no mention of Sarah by name, but the implication was clear. This was an isolated incident by a rogue employee, not a failure of institutional oversight. Sarah's phone rang. Dr. Cross. Have you seen the hospital's statement? Yeah. It's bullshit. Complete bullshit. Cross sounded angrier than Sarah had ever heard her. I'm at an emergency meeting right now with the board, and they're talking about damage control and liability management. Not about fixing the problems. Not about protecting staff. Just about protecting the institution. Are you surprised? I guess I shouldn't be, but I am. After everything that happened, I thought... Cross stopped herself. They're planning to use you as a scapegoat. They're going to claim you violated protocols by entering the hostage situation without authorization, that your military background made you act recklessly, that you endangered patients by not following proper procedures. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened. Let them. You don't understand. They're building a case to fire you for cause, which means you'd lose your license, your ability to work as a nurse anywhere. They're going to destroy your career to protect themselves. Then I'll destroy them first. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Cross spoke carefully. What are you planning? To show up to their meeting tomorrow and make them regret ever thinking I was someone they could intimidate into silence. Sarah paused. Will you back me up? Yes. And I'm bringing others. Every staff member who's been harassed by Tang or ignored by administration when they tried to report him. If they want to make this about you, we'll make it about them. After Cross hung up, Sarah spent the rest of the evening preparing. She printed every document she'd compiled, organized them chronologically, and created a timeline that showed the hospital's pattern of negligence. She rehearsed what she'd say, keeping it factual and cold. Emotion wouldn't help her tomorrow. Precision would. At midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from Walsh. FBI traced architect. You need to see this. Can you come to the station? Sarah drove to the downtown police station in her borrowed car. Cross had insisted she take her spare vehicle since Sarah's Honda was still impounded. The overnight streets were mostly empty, just a few delivery trucks and exhausted shift workers heading home. Walsh met her at the entrance and escorted her to a conference room where Brennan and 3 people Sarah didn't recognize were studying a wall covered in photographs and connecting lines. Reeves, this is Special Agent Marcus Kirby, FBI. Brennan gestured to a man in his 40s wearing a suit that had seen better days. They've been tracking the hospital attack network for 8 months, ever since a similar plot was disrupted in Phoenix. Kirby pulled up an image on a laptop and turned it towards Sarah. Recognize this man? The photograph showed a middle-aged man in an expensive suit standing outside what looked like a courthouse. Sarah studied the face, trying to place it. Should I? His name is Gerald Whitmore. He's a medical malpractice lawyer who's made a fortune suing hospitals over the past decade. Very successful, very connected, and until about 6 months ago, we had no reason to think he was anything other than what he appeared to be. Kirby pulled up more documents, financial records, encrypted communications, real estate purchases. But when we started connecting the dots between various attacks on healthcare facilities, we kept finding the same shell companies, the same money trails, all leading back to Whitmore. Why would a malpractice lawyer fund hospital attacks? Sarah asked. Because he doesn't just sue hospitals. He owns 6 nursing home chains, 4 urgent care networks, and has majority stakes in 2 pharmaceutical companies. He's been systematically targeting public hospitals to drive patients toward private facilities he controls. The attacks create fear, media coverage tanks the hospital's reputation, and suddenly people are willing to pay premium prices for private care that promises better security. The scope of it hit Sarah like a truck. How many hospitals? We've confirmed 4 attacks so far. Mercy Ridge was supposed to be the 5th, but Dylan Marsh's survival and testimony gave us the break we needed to connect everything. Kirby pulled up surveillance photos of Whitmore meeting with various people, time-stamped over several months. We're executing warrants tomorrow morning, but we need your testimony to make the case airtight. What do you need me to do? Tell the grand jury exactly what you saw and heard. Confirm Dylan Marsh's identity and testimony, and most importantly, Kirby hesitated. We need you to know that Whitmore has connections, political ones, legal ones. He's going to come after you hard, try to discredit your testimony before it even reaches trial. So, basically Tuesday, Walsh cracked a small smile. She's already dealing with the hospital board trying to fire her tomorrow. Adding a federal case probably doesn't even register. Brennan handed Sarah a folder. This is everything we have on Whitmore's network. Personnel, finances, communications. You'll need to review it before testifying, but the short version is this. He recruited disillusioned healthcare workers through online forums, radicalized them with rhetoric about corrupt hospitals killing patients, then funded and directed attacks designed to look like lone wolf incidents. Sarah flipped through the folder, her exhaustion making the words blur together. How long until trial? Months, maybe a year? These cases are complicated. Kirby closed his laptop. But we'll protect you during the process. Witness protection if necessary. I'm not hiding. You keep saying that. But the people you're up against don't care about fair fights. Walsh looked genuinely concerned. Whitmore's already hired a PR firm to start spinning narratives. By tomorrow, there will be stories questioning your mental health, your service record, your fitness as a nurse. They're going to try to destroy you before you ever set foot in a courtroom. Sarah stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Then they're going to learn the same lesson Tang did. I don't break easily. She left the police station at 2 a.m., her mind racing with everything she'd learned. The pieces were falling into place. Tang wasn't a lone gunman with a grudge. He was a recruited asset in a larger operation designed to profit from fear and chaos. And she'd accidentally become the person who could bring the whole thing down. Her phone buzzed. Another encrypted number, another message. $2 million. Walk away from the testimony, take the money, and disappear. This is your only offer. Sarah screenshot the message and sent it to Kirby's email, then blocked the number. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The fear had burned away, leaving only cold calculation and the kind of anger that sharpened focus instead of clouding it. She drove back to her apartment and tried to sleep for a few hours. Her alarm went off at 7, and she dressed carefully, professional but not submissive. Navy blazer, gray slacks, minimal jewelry. The kind of outfit that said she was taking this seriously but wasn't intimidated. Dr. Cross called at 8:30. I'm in the parking lot. Ready? As I'll ever be. They drove to Mercy Ridge together, pulling into a parking lot that was still cordoned off as a crime scene in several sections. News vans lined the street outside, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the hospital entrance. Sarah spotted Torres among them and gave him a slight nod. The administration building was separate from the main hospital, a newer structure designed to look corporate and imposing. Cross led Sarah to a conference room on the 3rd floor where the hospital board had assembled. 8 people sat around a massive oak table, 5 board members, 2 lawyers, and the hospital's CEO, a man named Richard Paulson, who Sarah had only ever seen in official communications. He looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of a corporate executive. Silver hair, expensive suit, and an expression that suggested he found all of this beneath him. Ms. Reeves, please sit. Paulson gestured to a chair isolated at one end of the table, separate from everyone else. A power play, obviously intended to make her feel outnumbered. Sarah sat without comment. Cross tried to sit beside her, but one of the lawyers cleared his throat. Dr. Cross, this is a closed personnel meeting. Unless you're here in an official capacity. I'm here as a witness to the events in question and as a colleague of Ms. Reeves. Cross didn't move. If you're discussing her actions, I have relevant testimony. The lawyer looked at Paulson, who nodded reluctantly. Cross sat, and 4 more staff members filed in behind her, nurses and techs who'd been at the hospital during the shooting. The power dynamic in the room shifted visibly. Paulson cleared his throat. Ms. Reeves, we're here to discuss the events of 2 nights ago and multiple violations of hospital protocol that occurred during your shift. We've reviewed security footage, incident reports, and witness statements. The board has serious concerns about your conduct, such as one of the lawyers opened a folder. Entering an active shooting situation without authorization from security or law enforcement. Performing medical procedures outside your scope of practice. Engaging in a hostage negotiation without proper training. And most significantly, treating an identified terrorist despite having knowledge of his crimes. Sarah kept her voice level. I'm a nurse. I treated patients who needed medical attention. That's my job. Your job is to follow hospital protocols designed to protect patients and staff. You repeatedly violated those protocols, putting yourself and others at risk. The lawyer slid a document across the table. This is a termination for cause. If you sign, you'll receive 2 weeks severance and a neutral reference. If you refuse, we'll pursue action against your nursing license. Sarah didn't touch the paper. Before I respond to that, I'd like the board to review some documents I've compiled. She pulled out her own folder and distributed copies around the table. Paulson's expression shifted from board authority to concern as he started reading. These are complaints filed against Marcus Tang over the past 3 years. 15 separate incidents reported by staff members documenting harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority. Every one of these complaints was either dismissed or mysteriously lost during review. Sarah's voice stayed calm and professional. I'm particularly interested in this one from 18 months ago, where a night shift nurse reported Tang following her to her car and threatening her after she refused his advances. That complaint was filed directly with HR and never resulted in any disciplinary action. One of the board members, an older woman whose nameplate read Dr. Susan Martinez, looked up sharply. I never saw this complaint. According to hospital records, it was marked resolved by the HR director at the time, who, interestingly, accepted a position at one of Gerald Whitmore's private care facilities 3 months later. The room went very quiet. Paulson's lawyer tried to recover. These allegations are documented, time-stamped, backed up by witness statements and security footage that still exists on the hospital servers. Sarah pulled out another document. I've also provided copies to the Columbus Dispatch, the FBI, and the State Medical Board. So you can threaten my license, but you're going to have a much bigger problem when the investigation expands to include the systematic mishandling of employee complaints. Dr. Martinez was reading faster now, her expression darkening. Richard, did you know about these? Paulson didn't answer. He was staring at Sarah with barely concealed fury. Cross spoke up from her end of the table. I witnessed Ms. Reeves save multiple lives during the shooting. I watched her run toward danger while others ran away. I was one of the hostages Tang held at gunpoint, and Ms. Reeves voluntarily entered that situation to protect patients and staff. If you fire her for that, you're going to have my resignation on your desk within the hour. The other staff members nodded. One of the nurses spoke up. Mine too. And mine. Same. Paulson's face was turning red. This is inappropriate. This is a personnel matter that you're trying to handle by silencing the one person who exposed how broken your system is. Dr. Martinez stood up, gathering the documents Sarah had distributed. I'm calling for an emergency vote to table this termination and launch an independent review of all HR procedures and complaints over the past 5 years. Dr. Martinez, I wasn't asking your opinion, Richard. All in favor? 4 hands went up immediately. Paulson and his lawyers sat frozen. Motion carries. Martinez turned to Sarah. Ms. Reeves, you're not fired. You're on paid administrative leave pending the investigation, which is standard procedure after traumatic incidents. Use the time to rest and cooperate with law enforcement. This meeting is adjourned. She walked out, taking 3 other board members with her. Paulson sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time. Sarah stood up slowly, gathering her documents. One more thing. Gerald Whitmore, the man who funded Tang's network, is being arrested this morning. The FBI will want to interview everyone in hospital administration about how Tang was hired, who approved his security clearances, and why his background checks somehow missed his connection to extremist groups. I suggest you get better lawyers. She walked out with Cross and the other staff members, leaving Paulson and his legal team sitting in the wreckage of their plan. In the parking lot, Cross let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for 20 minutes. That was incredible. How did you know Martinez would break ranks? I didn't, but I gambled that at least one board member would care more about the hospital's reputation than protecting the CEO. Sarah checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Kirby. And sometimes you just have to trust that not everyone in power is corrupt. Her phone rang. She answered on speaker. Reeves, it's Kirby. Whitmore's in custody. He lawyered up immediately, but we've got enough evidence to hold him. I need you to come in this afternoon for a formal statement. I'll be there. One more thing. We found something in Whitmore's office, a list of targets, names, addresses, detailed files. You're on it. Kirby's voice was grim, along with everyone who helped shut down his operation. We're arranging protection for... The line went dead. Sarah looked at her phone, no signal. That didn't make sense. She'd had full bars a second ago. Then she noticed the van parked 3 spaces away, engine running, driver's window tinted too dark to see through. Cross saw it at the same moment. Sarah! The van's door slid open, and 2 men in tactical gear jumped out. Sarah's combat training kicked in before conscious thought. She shoved Cross hard toward the space between parked cars and dropped low, using the vehicle beside them for cover. The tactical gear told her these weren't amateurs. Body armor, coordinated movement, professional execution. But the gear also told her something else. They weren't planning to kill her in a hospital parking lot. Too public. Too many cameras. Too much risk. This was a kidnapping attempt, which meant she had options. The first man moved around the front of Cross's car, weapon drawn but not firing. Sarah waited until he was committed to the angle, then swept his legs out from under him with a move she'd practiced 1,000 times in hand-to-hand training. He went down hard, his weapon skittering across the pavement. The second man was faster, already adjusting his approach. Sarah grabbed the fallen weapon, a taser, she noted, confirming they wanted her alive, and threw it at his face. It didn't hit, but it bought her the second she needed to close distance. She drove her shoulder into his midsection, using his own momentum against him. They hit the ground together, and Sarah's elbow found his throat before he could recover. He made a choking sound and went limp. Cross was already on her phone, screaming for security. Hospital staff were running toward them from the entrance. The first man Sarah had knocked down was trying to get up, and she kicked him in the head hard enough to keep him down. 2 more men emerged from the van. Sarah calculated her odds and didn't like them. She was exhausted, outnumbered, and these people had planned this carefully, but she'd survived worse situations with worse odds. Then police sirens split the air. Walsh's unmarked car came around the corner fast enough to leave rubber, followed by 2 patrol units. The men from the van made a split-second decision and dove back inside. The van peeled out, nearly hitting a parked car as it fled. Walsh was out of his vehicle before it fully stopped, weapon drawn, moving to secure the 2 men Sarah had taken down. Other officers were already calling in the van's description and blocking exits. Sarah sat down hard on the pavement, her hand shaking now that the immediate threat had passed. Cross dropped beside her, checking her for injuries with the automatic precision of a doctor. Are you hurt? No, you? Terrified but functional. Cross's hands were steady despite her words. What the hell was that? Walsh approached after cuffing the 2 men. That was Whitmore's insurance policy. He must have had a team standing by in case things went sideways. He looked at Sarah with something between respect and exasperation. You took down 2 trained operatives in under 30 seconds. They made the mistake of thinking I was just a nurse. Sarah accepted Walsh's hand up. Her body was going to hurt later. She'd definitely strained something in her shoulder during the takedown. But adrenaline was keeping everything manageable for now. The 2 captured men weren't talking, but their IDs told the story. Both were former military. Both had connections to private security contractors. Both had criminal records that suggested they weren't particular about which side of the law their paychecks came from. Brennan arrived 15 minutes later with an FBI tactical team. She looked at the scene, the captured operatives, the fleeing van, Sarah sitting on the hood of Cross's car with a split knuckle she hadn't noticed getting, and shook her head. This is what happens when you corner a billionaire with nothing to lose. He throws money at the problem until it disappears. She turned to Sarah. We're putting you in protective custody. No arguments this time. For how long? Until trial. Could be months. Sarah looked at the hospital entrance, at the news vans that were already repositioning to film the new development, at the staff members gathered in worried clusters. I can't disappear for months. I have testimony to give, a career to rebuild, and a hospital that needs to be held accountable. You also have targets on your back from multiple organizations. Brennan pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a screen full of encrypted chat logs. We broke into Whitmore's network. He's got contracts out on everyone involved in shutting him down. You, Dylan Marsh, the investigators, even some of the hospital board members who turned on Paulson. This isn't over. Walsh stepped closer. There's another option. We accelerate the grand jury proceedings, get your testimony on record immediately, then move you somewhere safe until we can round up the rest of Whitmore's network. How fast is immediately? Tomorrow morning, federal courthouse closed session. You testify, we get the indictments, and Whitmore loses his leverage. Sarah nodded slowly. Then let's do it. They moved her to a safe house on the outskirts of Columbus, a nondescript ranch house in a subdivision that looked like every other subdivision in America. 2 federal marshals stood guard while Brennan walked Sarah through what to expect at the grand jury. They'll ask you to identify Dylan Marsh, confirm the events of the shooting, and establish the timeline of Tang's actions. Keep your answers factual and brief. The prosecutors will guide you through, but Whitmore's lawyers will be looking for any inconsistency they can exploit later. Sarah spent the evening reviewing documents and drinking coffee that tasted like regret. Her phone was turned off per security protocols, cutting her off from the outside world. The isolation made everything feel surreal. Just 48 hours ago, she'd been sitting in her car after a normal shift, and now she was in witness protection preparing to testify against a criminal conspiracy. Cross had managed to get a message through via Brennan. The hospital board had voted to suspend Paulson pending investigation, and Dr. Martinez had been appointed interim CEO. The Columbus Dispatch was running daily updates on the scandal, each article uncovering new layers of institutional failure and corruption. Patient advocacy groups were demanding federal oversight. Nursing unions were calling for industry-wide reforms. One nurse's refusal to stay silent had cracked open a system that had been broken for years. Sarah tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept replaying the parking lot attack, calculating all the ways it could have gone differently. If Cross had been hurt, if the tactical team had been faster, if Walsh hadn't shown up when he did. She was still awake at 4 a.m. when Brennan knocked softly on her door. Can't sleep either? The detective entered carrying 2 cups of convenience store coffee. Trial preparation insomnia is normal. I've seen it in hundreds of witnesses. How many of them had multiple assassination attempts before testifying? More than you'd think, less than I'd like. Brennan sat in the chair by the window. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you just walk away? After the parking lot incident with Tang, you could have driven home, filed a complaint, and let someone else deal with the fallout. Why did you keep pushing? Sarah considered the question carefully. Because I spent 3 years in the Army watching people die because someone higher up made a bad call, and nobody had the guts to challenge it. I promised myself when I got out that I'd never be that person, the one who sees something wrong and stays quiet to protect their own career. She took a sip of the terrible coffee. Tang was small time. Whitmore's the real problem, and if I don't stand up now, when will I? When it's convenient, when it's safe. That day never comes. Wow, boys, not sad. Brennan nodded slowly. For what it's worth, what you're doing, it matters. Not just for this case, but for everyone who's been told to keep their head down and accept broken systems because that's just how things are. Will it actually change anything? Honestly, I don't know, but it's a hell of a lot better than doing nothing. The federal courthouse was a fortress of limestone and security checkpoints. Sarah entered through a back entrance at 6 a.m., escorted by marshals who moved with the casual alertness of people who expected trouble. The grand jury room was smaller than she'd imagined. Just a conference table, some chairs, and a court reporter whose fingers moved across her stenograph with mechanical precision. The prosecutors were efficient and professional, walking Sarah through her testimony with the care of people building a case they couldn't afford to lose. She identified Dylan Marsh from multiple photographs, confirmed the timeline of events, and provided detailed accounts of Tang's actions and statements. The grand jury members, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all looking like they wished they were anywhere else, listened with expressions ranging from horror to disbelief. When Sarah finished describing how she'd treated Dylan Marsh while he was bleeding out in the parking garage, one older woman openly cried. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Chen, closed her folder with a decisive snap. "Thank you, Ms. Reeves. Your testimony has been invaluable." What happens now? Now we indict Gerald Whitmore on 47 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, domestic terrorism, and racketeering, along with 16 co-conspirators across 4 states. Chen's expression was grim satisfaction. He's going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The indictments came down 3 hours later. Sarah watched the news coverage from the safe house, seeing Whitmore being led out of federal court in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his face pale. His lawyers gave statements about fighting the charges, about political persecution, about ambitious prosecutors overreaching. But the evidence was overwhelming. Tang's files, Dylan Marsh's testimony, financial records, encrypted communications, security footage, and Sarah's detailed account tying it all together into a narrative that was impossible to deny. By evening, the story had gone national. Cable news devoted entire segments to the conspiracy, interviewing experts about healthcare security and systemic corruption. Social media exploded with hashtags and hot takes, and at the center of it all was Sarah's name, repeated so many times it stopped feeling real. Torres called her through Brennan's phone. "You need to see this." He sent a link to a video that had gone viral. Security footage from inside Mercy Ridge during the shooting, showing Sarah running toward danger while others fled, treating patients with calm efficiency, and later walking into the ICU room to face Tang alone. Someone had edited it with swelling music and text overlays calling her a hero. Sarah watched it twice and felt nothing but exhaustion. The video showed actions, but it didn't show the fear, the doubt, the moments where she'd nearly broken. It turned a messy, terrifying situation into a clean narrative of heroism that felt like a lie. "I'm not a hero," she told Torres. "I'm just someone who refused to accept that broken systems can't be fixed." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," he replied. "Most people see problems and shrug. You saw problems and fought back." The safe house period stretched into a week, while federal agents rounded up the rest of Whitmore's network. Sarah spent the time doing something she hadn't done in years, processing everything that had happened. The trauma of the shooting, the betrayal of institutional corruption, the strange disconnection of becoming a national news story. Dr. Cross visited when security protocols allowed, bringing updates from the hospital. The investigation had uncovered years of buried complaints, not just about Tang, but about other staff members who'd used their positions to harass and abuse coworkers. The entire HR department had been restructured. New protocols were being implemented. And most significantly, a patient advocacy board was being created to provide oversight and accountability. "None of this would have happened if you'd stayed quiet," Cross said. "You know that, right? Or maybe it would have happened after the next Tang, with more people dead." Sarah's voice was flat. "I'm not looking for credit. I just want to make sure this actually changes things." "It already has. I've got nurses from 3 other hospitals reaching out, asking how we pushed back. They want to know they can speak up without destroying their careers." Cross leaned forward. "You started something bigger than you realize." 2 weeks after the indictments, Sarah's administrative leave ended. The hospital board formally cleared her of all protocol violations and issued a public apology for the initial investigation. They offered her position back with a raise, an official commendation, and a promise of better institutional support. Sarah turned them down, not out of spite or anger, but because she'd realized something during those quiet days in the safe house. She didn't want to go back to the same job in the same place, even if the system had improved. She'd spent too many years reacting to crises instead of preventing them. Colonel Vance called again, this time with a revised offer. Not a teaching position, but a role developing trauma protocols and training programs for military and civilian medical personnel. A chance to take everything she'd learned and use it to prepare the next generation for situations like the one she'd survived. Sarah accepted. The trial came 6 months later. Whitmore's defense team tried everything, challenging evidence, attacking witnesses, spinning conspiracy theories about government overreach. But the facts were too solid, the documentation too thorough, and the testimony too consistent. Sarah spent 3 days on the stand, walking through every detail of that night. Whitmore's lawyers tried to break her credibility, suggesting she'd acted recklessly, that her military training made her prone to violence, that she had personal motivations for attacking Tang and his associates. Sarah answered every question with calm precision, never rising to the bait, never letting them see anything but professional competence. On the fourth day, during cross-examination, Whitmore's lead attorney made a mistake. He asked why she hadn't just followed hospital protocol and let trained professionals handle the situation. Sarah looked directly at Whitmore across the courtroom. Because the trained professionals were part of the problem. Because following protocol meant letting people die while administrators protected themselves. Because sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to refuse to participate in it. The courtroom went silent. So you admit you violated hospital policy? The attorney thought he had her. I admit I chose saving lives over protecting careers, and I'd make the same choice again. The jury deliberated for 7 hours, guilty on all counts. Whitmore showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but Sarah saw his hands tighten on the defense table. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Dylan Marsh, who'd cooperated with investigators and testified against the network, received 12 years with possibility of parole after 8. He'd never be the same person who'd walked into that hospital with a rifle, but Sarah had visited him once during his recovery, and she'd seen something in his eyes that gave her hope. Not redemption exactly, but awareness, understanding of what he'd been part of and the damage it had caused. The Mercy Ridge reforms became a model for other hospitals. Within a year, 3 states had passed legislation requiring independent oversight of healthcare security and mandatory reporting structures for staff complaints. Patient advocacy groups cited Sarah's case as evidence that institutional change was possible when individuals refused to accept the status quo. Sarah testified before a congressional committee about healthcare security and worker protection. She gave interviews to nursing journals and medical publications. She became an uncomfortable symbol of resistance against systemic failure, a role she neither wanted nor could avoid. But the work she did at Fort Sam, Houston, developing trauma protocols, training medics, and teaching battlefield medicine to the next generation, that was where she found purpose. Not in being a symbol, but in doing something concrete to prevent others from facing the same situations unprepared. 1 year after the shooting, Sarah returned to Columbus for the anniversary memorial at Mercy Ridge. The hospital had installed a plaque in the main entrance honoring the victims and survivors, and hospital administrators gave speeches about how tragedy had spurred positive change. Sarah stood at the back of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention. When they called her name to speak, she almost didn't go up. But Dr. Cross caught her eye and nodded, and Sarah found herself walking to the podium. She looked out at the crowd, hospital staff, patients' families, community members who'd followed the story. And she thought about what she wanted them to understand. A year ago, I sat in a parking lot outside this hospital after a shift that had broken something inside me. I was exhausted, traumatized, and trying to hold myself together long enough to drive home. When security called the police on me for existing in that space, I had a choice. I could have left, driven away, filed a complaint later and hoped someone took it seriously. Sarah paused, remembering that night with perfect clarity. But I stayed. Not because I'm brave or special, but because leaving would have meant accepting that the system was more important than the people it was supposed to serve. And I'd spent too many years watching people suffer because nobody wanted to challenge broken systems. She looked directly at the hospital staff in the crowd. What happened here wasn't just one security guard gone wrong. It was years of ignored warnings, buried complaints, and institutional priorities that valued reputation over safety. And it took a mass shooting to force people to pay attention. That's the real tragedy. Not that it happened, but that it took something this catastrophic to make people care. Some of the administrators looked uncomfortable. Good. If you take anything from this anniversary, take this. You don't need to wait for disaster to demand change. You don't need permission to speak up about problems. And you don't need to be a hero to refuse to participate in broken systems. You just need to decide that your voice matters more than your comfort. Sarah stepped down from the podium to scattered applause. Some people got it. Others would never understand. That was fine. She'd learned that she couldn't save everyone or fix everything, but she could refuse to be silent, and that was enough. After the ceremony, she found Walsh waiting by her car. He'd been promoted to detective sergeant and now oversaw training for crisis response. They'd stayed in touch over the year, a friendship forged in the kind of pressure that either broke people or bound them together. That was a good speech, Walsh said. Uncomfortable but good. The truth usually is. Sarah unlocked her car, a newer model with working windows and intact tires. How's the department handling the reforms? Better than expected. Turns out when you hold people accountable and change policies instead of just releasing statements, things actually improve. Walsh pulled out his phone and showed her training materials. We're using your case as a teaching example now. What not to do mostly, but also how to recognize when institutional procedures are failing. Sarah scrolled through the materials and felt something unfamiliar. Satisfaction. Not at being right, but at seeing concrete results from the fight. You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd driven away that night? Walsh asked. Every day. Sarah handed back his phone. But I didn't, and I'm still here. That has to count for something. She drove back to Fort Sam Houston, leaving Columbus behind but carrying the lessons forward. The work she did now, training medics, developing protocols, teaching the next generation, felt like something that mattered in ways that extended beyond headlines and trials. Her students were young, idealistic, and convinced they knew how they'd react under pressure. Sarah's job was to prepare them for the reality that training could never fully anticipate. She taught them battlefield medicine, but she also taught them something harder: how to recognize when the systems they served were failing, and how to speak up even when silence was easier. One evening, after a particularly difficult training simulation, a young medic named Private Marcus Johnson approached her. Sergeant Reeves, can I ask you something? Go ahead. The hospital thing, when you went into that ICU room with the armed security guard. Weren't you terrified? Sarah considered lying, giving him the hero's answer about duty and courage. But these kids deserve better than comfortable fiction. I was absolutely terrified. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. Every instinct I had said to run. She looked at Johnson's young face, seeing echoes of her younger self. But fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. What matters is what you do while you're afraid. How do you know you're making the right choice? You don't. Not in the moment. You make the best call you can with the information you have, and you live with the consequences. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. The young woman with the chest tube, recovered now, who'd sent Sarah a thank you card. But sometimes you get confirmation that it was worth it. Johnson nodded slowly, processing the answer. I hope I can be that brave when it matters. You will be, because I'm going to train you until fear doesn't stop you from doing what needs to be done. That night, alone in her base housing, Sarah thought about the journey from that parking lot confrontation to this moment. She'd lost things along the way. The comfortable anonymity of being just another nurse, the ability to blend into crowds without being recognized, the simple certainty of routine. But she'd gained something harder to quantify: purpose, agency. The knowledge that one person refusing to accept injustice could crack open systems that seemed impenetrable. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Cross. Another hospital just contacted me asking about our reforms. That makes 15 this month. You started a movement. Sarah typed back, I just refused to shut up. The movement started when other people decided to do the same. She thought about Tang, whose paranoia and corruption had sparked a chain reaction he never anticipated. About Whitmore, whose greed had destroyed his empire and exposed networks of exploitation across the country. About Dylan Marsh, who'd been radicalized by rhetoric and was now serving as a cautionary tale about the cost of blind anger. And she thought about all the people who'd stayed silent when they saw problems, who'd filed complaints that got buried, who'd accepted that systems couldn't change because fighting felt too hard. Sarah had been one of those people once, exhausted after a brutal shift, sitting in a parking lot, just wanting to go home and forget the day. If Tang hadn't called the police on her, would she have ever pushed back? Or would she have remained one more nurse grinding through shifts in a broken system, too tired to fight? She'd never know. And maybe that was the point. Change didn't come from perfect people making heroic choices. It came from imperfect people refusing to accept unacceptable situations, even when they were exhausted and scared and uncertain. Sarah looked at her calendar. Tomorrow she was teaching combat trauma response, preparing medics for situations where seconds mattered and mistakes cost lives. Next week, she was testifying before another congressional committee about healthcare worker protection. Next month, she was speaking at a nursing conference about institutional accountability. None of it felt heroic. It felt like work that needed doing by someone stubborn enough to do it. Her cat. The same one who'd witnessed her breakdown and recovery jumped onto her lap and demanded attention. Sarah stroked his fur and felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. This was enough. The work, the purpose, the stubborn refusal to let corruption win. She thought about the message spray-painted on her windshield. "You should have run." And she smiled, because whoever wrote that had fundamentally misunderstood who she was. Sarah Reeves had survived war zones and mass shootings. She'd faced down armed hostage takers and corrupt billionaires. She'd been threatened, intimidated, and told to stay in her lane by people who saw her as a problem to be eliminated. But she was still here, still fighting, still refusing to accept that broken systems couldn't be fixed. And that, more than any verdict or reform or congressional testimony, was the real victory. Not that she'd won, but that she'd fought, and that her fighting had made space for others to do the same. The exhausted nurse in the parking lot had become something she never expected. Not a hero in the Hollywood sense, but something more valuable. A reminder that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary injustice, and that speaking up was worth it, even when the cost seemed unbearable. Sarah finished her coffee, closed her laptop, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new moments where silence would be easier than truth. But she'd spent too long learning the lesson to forget it now. The only thing more dangerous than speaking up was staying silent. And she was done being silent.